Thank you very much, Arthur, for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. My name's Chris Arning. I hope you've had a good morning so far and are ready for the April ICG webinar. So, as you can see from the slide you can see in front of you, I run a company called Creative Semiotics. I'm founder and owner of Creative Semiotics, and it's an agency whose mission it is to be the most pioneering and exciting semiotic specialists. I'm going to come on to what semiotics is, as you can see in this table of contents. Essentially, I set up the company in October 2010 and created it to help brand owners think differently about their brands and to make better informed business decisions. Now, my background is in planning and in qualitative research. I spent over 8 years with an agency called Flamingo Research, where I ran international research projects, and have been conducting semiotics projects for about 10 years. So I'm here today to talk to you about semiotics and to give you the basics on what it is, how it works, and what it's good for in the worlds of brands and marketing. So just to run through the format of the presentation, you should be on slide 2, which should be quite logical. I'm going to give you an outline on semiotics, what it is, what it's not, then explain some principles of semiotics in order to explain how it works. I will then explain the rationale for semiotics, the benefits and its usefulness and applications, as well as going through some case studies. I'll be talking for about 30 minutes before I then hand over to my friend and longtime collaborator Asif Noorani of Epiphany Productions, who will give his unique perspective on how semiotics adds value and why he continues to write me into his proposals. And Asif will be talking for about 10 minutes or so. Then, as Arthur said, there'll be time for questions, any questions you'll have, and I hope you'll have some questions. Sound good? Well, I assume that's a yes. So I'm moving on to the next slide. So, what is semiotics? That is the $1 billion question. Well, for those of you that have come to the webinar misinformed, it's not the study of underground tremors and volcanoes. That's seismology. It's also not a cult patronized by Hollywood superstars either. That would be Scientology. This is semiotics, the study of signs and meaning. If you'll indulge me, we'll be going into a little bit of history of semiotics, which is sort of unavoidable. So please do indulge me. So we're going on to slide 4. So semiotics studies the implicit messages that are embedded in signs and symbols and all the signs and symbols we see around us all the time. So take these toilet doors on the left. These are universal icons that indicate the gender of the public toilets and therefore what's the appropriate door to go through. They are interpreted effortlessly because we have been conditioned into associating the abstract silhouettes with men and women. On the right, however, we have signs that are more ambiguous. They take longer to decode and to understand what lies behind the door of that toilet. Putting these icons on the door of a toilet will probably communicate something significant about the establishment in which they are situated, that they cater for a select group of people with certain values, perhaps in a bar for medics or biologists. So this is a very basic example of how signs create meaning for us in different ways. So on to the next slide. Semiotics comes from the Greek word semion, which means sign. Going to click onto the next slide. Semiotics comes from the Greek word semion, which means sign, and was originally connected with bodily symptoms. But semiotics is not just about the content of messages and what they literally say, but also the metaphors and the other shades of meaning contained with them, and the added meanings that are propagated. So, for example, if you look at this word, the angularity of the way the word is rendered and the engraved effect gives you a clue to its ancient origins. I think you'd agree, if it was written in basic Arial or Comic Sans Serif, it would give a very different impression. So continuing this meaning and this theme about the detail of signs containing residues of meaning, there's a great little film which I wanted to show you, but unfortunately due to technological limitations cannot, called Sound and Image. And essentially it's a way of looking at how added meanings are conveyed through non-verbal metaphors, and how these can be as powerful and sometimes more powerful in conveying messages. I've included the URL here if you want to download the presentation later and peruse it at your leisure. But I think the examples here speak for themselves. They convey something about the meaning of the word through visual metaphor that adds to your impression of the meaning conveyed. So, on to the next slide. The thing about semiotics is that because we are ensconced in this world of signs and we become automatic and automatized in the way we process them, we're a little bit like fish within water. We literally become desensitized to how signs wash over us and condition us to behave in a certain way. Think, for instance, about how a film soundtrack primes you to feel a sense of foreboding about what may be about to happen, or how it can imbue what is happening on screen with great poignancy, even though not much may be happening. Semiotics is actually about a sense of estrangement. It's about shaking us out of the stupor, showing us what surrounds us and what's influencing us, and helps us see it with new eyes. It's like revealing the matrix of meaning that underlies our communication. I'm mixing my metaphors here, but I think you can also see that it's making us aware of the water within which we swim as sign users. So, one useful semiotic principle is the principle of notness, and that's the principle that you can best define something by showing what it is not. So I told you I'd say a little bit about what semiotics is not. That's because there's a lot of confusion about what semiotics is and what it isn't. Firstly, semiotics is not psychology. While semiotics does look at the underlying conditions of meaning, it's not like putting a patient on the couch and trying to unravel the link between thoughts and behaviors, though it is, I understand, easy to see the parallels, because people like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud did study symbolism too in unearthing the secrets of the unconscious. But semiotics does not claim to know why people think and behave they do. It only claims to be able to reveal the cultural influences and conventions that exist that predispose them to react in certain ways. So that's a little bit about what semiotics is not. So that the second confusion that often arises is between semiotics and semantics, and it's true to say they do sound similar. So here's a bit of eye candy for you, which is a way of distinguishing different versions of the word piqua, and it shows the semantics of the world. Actually, semantics and semiotics do have a close link, but semantic processing is a branch of linguistics, has to do with the meaning of words, but not so much with other broader forms of representation and communication, for example, visual representation, which of course is what brands trade upon so powerfully. Semantics is, however, to do with meaning, and both do come from a common root in the world of linguistics, so that's where the confusion comes in. But semiotics is more Umberto Eco, semantics is more Noam Chomsky, for those that are aware of those names. Thirdly, semiotics is not the same as discourse analysis. Like semantics, discourse analysis is much more focused on language and patterns of linguistic usage within certain social groups. The key idea here is that of a relationship between power and knowledge, that truth depends on the power interests that tend to be reigning at any particular juncture. But discourse analysis do also analyse cultural texts like semioticians do, and it is a mode of critical reading, but it has different concerns and methods, as we'll go on to see. So essentially, my view on semiotics is that it's simply a perspective incorporating many areas of knowledge from art theory to anthropology, and can even borrow from musicology and music theory when looking at sound. But it always asks the question, how is meaning generated in this text? And I'll come on to what a text is in a second. How does it come about? So semiotics is about laying bare the way meaning is created, how it's created, by making explicit how science and communication works. And in doing so, it allows us to see things with new eyes. So I talked about going into a little bit of history, so I hope you'll indulge me. I know you didn't come necessarily to this webinar with a history lesson in mind, but I think it's important to establish the roots of the discipline. So semiotics goes back to the ancients, people like St. Augustine and Galen and others. But as a formal discipline, semiotics was founded over 100 years ago, and interestingly, independently by two thinkers on either side of the Atlantic. One in the United States, Charles Sanders Peirce, and one in Switzerland, Ferdinand de Saussure. So those of you that study linguistics at university will be aware of Saussure, as he's been acknowledged as the founder of structural linguistics, and he also introduced the term semiology, later called semiotics, although they still called the discipline semiology on the continent. And he saw semiology as studying the life of signs in society. So you can see how that already seems very relevant to branding. Charles Peirce saw the universe, as he called it, as perfused with signs. While his theory has been hard to get many people's head around, it's also been very influential in the semiotic discipline too. So, how does semiotics work? Well, essentially, moving on to the next slide, semiotics works by a process of analysis whereby products of culture are read as if as a language. And through studying how cultural inferences work, we develop powers of interpretation. Semiotics practitioners train themselves over time to be like super decoders of culture. We don't pretend to speak for every member of culture. We contend there are certain generally agreed conventions and correlations that can be identified in terms of how we make meaning out of certain signs and cultural texts. A text, by the way, is simply anything created by a person designed to create meaning in culture. And it's not confined just to written books like the Quran or the Bible, but also includes films, plays, websites, and of course branded material, as we'll come on to. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all the principles of semiotics in detail, but I would suggest that amongst the principles of semiotics, two of the most important are number one, denotation and connotation, and number two, intertextuality. So if we cover the first one first, if you look at the image on the left, we can see the picture of a rose. And on the most obvious level, this is simply a flower with a connection with gratitude and certain social occasions and ceremonies. But it also has multiple connotations and associations with love, chivalry, romance. In England, it has resonances with the Tudor dynasty and has come to signify England as a country, of course, as a symbol of the rugby team, for example. And of course, in the logo on the right with the Labour Party, in short, with power. As to give you an example of how another principle of semiotics, that meaning is context dependent, if you go to Iran, for example, the rose is associated with Sufi poetry and other connotations. So these connotations do depend on context, which is why semiotics is quite a complex discipline and needs to be taken, treated with care when you establish what meanings certain signs convey. On to the next slide, and continuing the theme of denotation and connotation. In the luxury goods sector, there's a focus on sensoriality and experience over functionality in order to convey value. This is particularly true of the cognac category, where brands have built meaning into their product design. If we consider this Courvoisier bottle, for example, the feminine fluted curves combine with the rotundity of the bottle to convey a sort of alluring and intoxicating combination of masculinity and femininity. On the one level, it's an object of beauty like a perfume bottle, but it's also, through its rotundity and squatness, as an object of symbolic power. Of course, the emblem of Napoleon with his arm in his coat is a sign of self-made success. Napoleon, of course, was a self-made commoner who became emperor, and it conveys this idea of smug self-assuredness. On the face of it, this makes this visual sign ideal as an emblem for a cognac brand, where cognac is often drunk as a sign of success and achievement. So you can see already how signs are used in order to convey meanings about the brand and what it stands for. As another example of denotation and connotation, we have these two chairs, which convey very different impressions of meaning, and also would suggest to you different values in terms of the purchaser. On the left, we have the Ghost Chair by Philip Stark, which is a clever in-joke for designers, for those that can trace the references to Louis XIV and the sort of throne motif within the arms. Sorry, on the right I meant, rather than the left. On the left, we have a chair designed by the Campana brothers, who are Brazilian designers very much in vogue at the moment, who incorporate hardwoods from the Brazilian rainforest into their design and convey this notion of sustainability. I believe they use sustainable woods, by the way, and channel some profits back into that concern. And this shows, in the contrast between these two chairs, how drastically we can alter the meaning through form, material, and look within the context of the same object. So although essentially they're both chairs, the way they're rendered conveys very different meanings about the owner and what they want to convey about their values. And this is a semiotic principle. The second semiotic principle that I mentioned, which I'll spend less time on just in the interest of finishing within time, is that of intertextuality, which holds that semiotics must look at the way that texts, which include anything that can have a meaning, as I've suggested, from books to films to pieces of music, how they join up and how they communicate within one another, how they refer to one another through allusion, through quotation, through parody or pastiche. So often brands, particularly in what's been referred to as a postmodern digital age, have resorted to parody or pastiche to show their awareness of their customers' world, that they are culturally switched on, or simply that they can see beyond the narrow confines of their business. Volkswagen, for example, for whom I've done some work, has often, as a brand, been credited with having quite a dry, clever sense of humour, obviously established back in the States in the 60s with the Doyle Dane Burnback campaign, famously in the 1960s, where they made a small car seem like a positive virtue. And in this ad, as you can see, in this print ad, they give a nod to the 60s and what were back then countercultural icons, obviously the British brand, the Beatles, which coincidentally happens to share the same pronunciation with their iconic vehicle which they were launching. So you can see how, therefore, that's a way of building brand identity and communication through intertextuality. So on to the next slide. Well, what does semiotics look at in the process of analysis? Well, semiotics is a combination of digging into the detail and taking a step back and fitting it into the big picture. So, you know, it does look at how brands represent themselves through the visual materials that they use. One thing to notice in this slide is color. Now, color is one of the trickiest things to analyze in semiotics because it has both the direct and an associative value. So in terms of the direct value, red is physiologically associated with threat, a sense of aggression. It's been proven if you put people in pink rooms, they calm down. There are various other studies that indicate that. But at the same time, it could also indicate political affiliation, for example. Red as a color, or certainly has done historically. Orange can mean bright and progressive, but in the Indian context, it can convey affiliation with Hindu nationalism, for example. And as we know, colors have different meanings in different contexts. But also in terms of brand use, color can be used to color code individual products or sub-brands within a product range, where the individual meaning isn't really about conveying values, but just about differentiation. It can be used to create salience on shelf, and sometimes brands just confirm to color codes as a kind of Me Too cost of entry strategy for launching into a new category, brands particularly without stature in that category. And I think you can see in these three ads that these are fairly formulaic color uses for the category, looking at food on the left, cognac in the middle, and sort of eroticized femininity by Kenzo on the right, using red for danger. So it's not just color that semiotics looks at. Another area is typography. So the use of different types and fonts and typefaces is very important. I've just relaunched my new website, and I'm using a font called Nexa, which I think is very slick and conveys notions of modernity, but is also very easy to read. And it's something that's really, I think, given new life to my templates and my visual identity. And sometimes just changing the typeface gives a completely different tone to a poster, a piece of packaging, or even one's perception of the price point of an object. And this is something that's being used in, for example, the area of premiumization in FMCG, where companies are keen to tap into the rising middle class and mass affluence by creating ranges that are slightly more sophisticated within the budget of their customers. And often changing the typeface, color, and those other things can do that. So you'll recognize the typeface on the left. It's called Helvetica. It's been praised by some designers as a perfectly neutral typeface, and perfectly adaptable, and decried by others as the foot soldier of capitalism because of its very ubiquity. So it's quite a polarizing typeface. But this just, in and of itself, looking at how the connotations of Helvetica has changed over time, is a lesson on how signs change and grow. I've written a piece on the London Olympic logo for those who are interested as well, which is, for me, an example of how signs accrue meaning over time, depending on what they're associated with. And of course, semiotics does look at symbolism, very important. But often symbolism isn't about the obvious signs. It's not about things that are kind of isolated in a visual plane that you can see. Symbolism is sometimes about shades of meaning. But where it is more obvious is when you look at the area of logos, which condense meaning into a compact visual sign. Logos have been called the corporate heraldry of the modern age. In the Middle Ages, signs painted on shields represented baronial families at tournament or in court. Nowadays, companies use logo types as trademarks to stamp their unique identity, but to also neatly encapsulate brand narratives. So BP on the left has got rid of the defensive military shield and adopted a lotus-like flower as an indicator of new corporate strategy. Unilever similarly changed from a rigid and monolithic U to a sort of cornucopia, incorporating its various products and brands. So you can see how logos have changed over time as well. But this work of a semiotics practitioner does not stop with identifying signs. This is just the start of the process, and these are the minimal units of meaning. But the need is to go beyond this, identify the codes that bring these signs to life. So this is a diagram from a project I did for the car category. And these are different codes and ways of communicating. I've called them regression on the left, deconstruction, expressionism, and digitization. This is a big part of a big story about essentially car manufacturers recycling codes and sharing codes, and there being an increasing lack of differentiation between cars in the same way as car manufacturers share body shapes and chassis shapes. There's a kind of sharing of metaphors in the car market. And essentially at the bottom you see the various signs listed. At the top you see what the meaning is of those signs. So kind of bright primary colours, a child-parent reversal, metaphors of play, a mischief turns into a regression code. Now I recognise that code is one of the harder things to get your head around in semiotics, but I'm hoping just to kind of plant that seed in your head, and I'm happy to answer questions on it a bit later. So semiotics does go through a process in the analysis. Just like there's sample setting, recruitment, moderation of groups, and analysis interpretation process in qualitative research, there's also a process with applied semiotics too. I'm not going to take you through all these steps, but it does involve setting the parameters of the brief, where because semiotics is very labor intensive, it's really important to create the right balance between breadth of scope and depth of analysis. Those of course are trade-offs. And just as an FYI, semiotics projects take anywhere from a week to a month for the bigger projects. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So it's just, I thought, worth setting out for those who are familiar with qualitative research, how semiotics and qualitative research projects differ. This is because I'm assuming most people on the call, given the ICG's client base, familiar with qualitative research. So as you can see, semiotics on the right is based on different premises, has a different methodology, looks at and for different things in terms of the domain of study, and employs different techniques than qualitative research. Although qualitative research are often surprised that in terms of grounded theory and the ways in which it classifies data, there are clearly similarities to the analysis process in that sense. And my background was in qualitative research before I moved into semiotics. So I consider myself an honorary qualitative researcher. As can be seen on this slide, there is a sense in which, in my experience, semiotics and qualitative research are very complementary. I mean, I'm currently involved in a project where semiotics is involved in generating a range of images to be used as provocation in some discussion groups. And often this seems to happen particularly with packaging studies. Also, well, as a different use, in packaging studies, semiotics helps to contextualize and make sense of what comes out of the group interactions. It can also be used to analyze collages, add depth of interpretation to other materials generated by research participants, and that's online and offline. So there's a way in which they use, they combine and synergize very well. So we're now going to consider the rationale for conducting semiotics projects. Asif will be talking about this too in his section, but you're probably wondering, why is all this important? Well, I intend to convince you that semiotics is a valuable methodology for bringing fresh consumer insight to bear on brand problems. So, as can be seen from this slide, the next slide, branding is increasingly pervasive. As we know, the purpose of marketing is, alongside satisfying consumer needs, to create preference for a company or organization's goods or services in order to increase revenue and shareholder value. But while securing loyalty involves many, many factors, at its most basic, a brand is a symbolic entity made up of cultural units. That is to say, a cluster of signs. So the shapes, the colors, and the fictions that imbue a brand with meaning make it less anonymous, more differentiated, and less commoditized. And I would argue that studying the way brands are built up is the missing piece of the puzzle that helps us really understand how consumer-brand interactions really happen. So most people, when they see the brand, only see the superficial layer on the surface, the public face of the brand, so to speak. But lying beneath the surface of many brands is a rich universe of assumptions, hidden meanings, myths, and often unwitting and inadvertent associations, both historical and connected with a competitive set. This means that most brands mean both more and less than they're intended to do. And critically, this may be picked up upon by their customers, although it may be missed internally by those who work for them and perhaps are oblivious to how they produce meaning. So semiotics is useful because it brings these meanings to the surface so that they can be identified and audited. And semiotics does have a number of different uses in marketing and in brands. And having practiced semiotics for a number of years, I've sort of boiled them down to 4 basic uses, although within the context of each of these there are a myriad of different projects that can be undertaken. And I've chosen a natty little icon for my website to to represent each of the service offerings. So there's brand understanding, brand inspiration, brand evaluation, and global intelligence. So perhaps the most common form of semiotics project is that of brand understanding. This often comes under the rubric of the deep dive, the usage and attitude study, or the brand health check. But it can also be when companies are launching into completely new categories and wanting to understand the rules of this category. I mean, I've undertaken brand understanding projects in telecommunications, in confectionery, in automotive, and in pharmaceuticals. And it is tends to be one of the more common requests I get contacted with. Then there's brand inspiration, and don't get me wrong, there is clearly an overlap between these two. Often brand understanding should be inspiring, and you gain understanding from inspiration. But I do think there's subtle differences. This is where semiotics helps to make the invisible visible. It helps brands to see around corners and open up new vistas. So semiotics is often valued for its provocative stance and its ability to bring fresh perspectives to bear. This can be about confounding settled ideas or giving new ways of thinking. So often semiotics work can produce a short think piece that sparks thought. It's not always about covering all the ground, but just about giving 2 or 3 inspiring nuggets to the advertising account planner, the designer, or the brand guardian to help them take things in a new direction. And semiotics is often used successfully in pitches as well as in ongoing business development. Particularly, it has an advantage in being relatively quick to conduct versus conducting groups. Then there's brand evaluation. So of course, businesses sometimes have crucial decisions to make about how to convey what they stand for. This might be a need to assess the merits of a new logo or to adjudicate between different corporate identity routes, necessitated, for example, by a merger of 2 separate companies with different visual identities that need to be fused together. What semiotics does well here is to offer frameworks for analysis, which makes the choice less subjective, and it gives a red thread of logic as to why it's suggesting and recommending certain routes. So for example, what makes a premium yogurt premium in terms of packaging? Well, you can go into typeface, you can go into the use of space and composition, and the sorts of symbols and cultural references that are made on pack. So most of my work for the co-creation agency ICA, who's become a strategic partner of mine over the last couple of years, is done on evaluation work. And then finally, there's global intelligence. We live in a globalized world, of course. Whilst tastes are arguably becoming more homogeneous, brands still need to take account of local differences. And communication codes differ significantly per market. Just look at a show reel of international beer communication to see evidence of this. And even regions with common language and history, such as North America and Britain, show significant differences. Since I've set up Creative Semiotics, I've looked at the meaning of invigoration in China, Thailand, Mexico, and how to convey that as a brand proposition, and the meaning of simplicity, for example, in India, France, and the US. And so what I'm going to do now is loop back and go through each of these service areas exemplified with case studies in terms of the challenge, the role for semiotics, and then the outcome. I go through these fairly rapidly. So to give you an example of a brand understanding project, one of my first projects as Creative Semiotics involved an analysis of the cognac category in order to help design more design coherence for a Pernod Ricard brand, Martell. And this involved understanding how best to involve the Martell brand and bottle by analysis of the competitive product design and graphic design. And it also then recommended, as part of a global project, which visual equities to keep, jettison, and which visual equities to evolve, and with some ideas for how to evolve those visual equities. Another project I conducted, which would come under the rubric of brand understanding, is a study I did in the automotive field. This was essentially about honing a creative development brief and making a brand proposition slightly more interesting and more fleshed out. And this involved arming the agency with more cultural awareness. And so in order to do this, I conducted an analysis of car codes across 5 years of car communication, and I delivered a think piece that helped hone and flesh out the brief for the agency. And the result was the launch advertising for the GT86 Toyota, which was very impactful advertising that merged both technology and humanity in a really interesting way. So those are the 2 brand understanding projects. In terms of brand inspiration, on another project, this was one of the greatest successes actually I've been associated with. I worked on it before I set up Creative Semiotics, But I think it's a great example of how just looking closely at what surrounds you and comparing different categories can give you a competitive advantage and a great springboard into innovation. So we want to pitch to create new brands for Wrigley's, essentially, for a mature teen target. And the project involved feeding into an innovation process. What I looked at in part of the semiotics was to compare the signs and symbols in general teen culture as a whole and the gum category. And essentially what resulted in terms of the findings was the massive discrepancy and incongruence between those two categories, that teen culture was becoming darker, more existential, more mature, and the gum category wasn't reflecting this in any way. So hence there was an opportunity for a brand to create a slightly more mature, edgier, and interesting visual identity. And this was since become an incredibly successful brand, which was sparked off essentially by a semiotic insight. So that's the use of semiotics in brand inspiration. On another project more recently, an ex-Flamingo colleague hired me to help inspire a design team at P&G to create a new design language for a male grooming range. And they wanted this grooming range to be positioned as progressive and to convey notions of masculinity. And this meant an audit of masculine industrial design categories, from guns to cars to baby buggies and kitchenware, the latter two categories which have become far more bulked up and muscular in the last few years, which is an interesting change in gender codes. And here are just two of the objects we looked at: a sculpted bike cycle light on the left and a Marc Jacobs perfume on the right. And essentially the output was an inspirational springboard for the design team by giving them a menu of different masculine design languages, from sort of brutalism to a kind of sleek modernism. In terms of brand evaluation, I think a really good example of this is some work I did in Brighton working with the agency Space Doctors. They were approached to help a Norwegian bank choose a new corporate identity. There were 4 routes on the table, which I won't show you, but they had a very clear idea, the bank, on what they wanted to convey and sort of the values they wanted to convey with the new design. So Semiotics essentially looked at the design in terms of its cultural references across 4 markets, and the output established a clear rationale for why 2 of the routes were utterly wrong on the grounds of conveying the wrong values or lack of salience, and why 2 of them showed good potential for use. And interestingly, there was a great consonance between the result of the semiotics and the result of the qualitative research. Although the semiotics did recommend a slightly edgier route, which in Norway was preferred as a kind of more design literate market, the other markets being in the Baltics and Central Europe. Another example of brand evaluation, as I said, is I do a lot of work with ICA, and they're employed by some of the biggest brands in the world to source creative, imaginative content from all over the world. I'm a big believer in crowdsourcing. I know it works because I source my very own creative semiotics logo from a nice chap in Peru, in Lima, Peru. So, and I've worked with ICA on a number of projects, and generally what they require is a filter to help filter down entries. They get sent an enormous number of entries from different countries around the world, up to 200 entries, for example, for some project, and they need some rationale for filtering them down. And to establish some transparency in terms of assessment and ranking. So they find that semiotics is an incredibly useful methodology in helping them do that. Just in terms of global intelligence, just to go through these 2 examples fairly swiftly. I worked with a consortium of Mexican companies late last year. As you may or may not know, if depending on whether you're very up to date with your international relations, a new president was elected in Mexico towards the end of last year, a gentleman called Nieto Peña, and he had a mandate for change. And my clients felt that there's an opportunity to usher in a new way of Mexico representing itself to the world. And as you're probably aware, the notion of soft power, coined by the Harvard scholar Joseph Nye, has become very important. This is the extent to which nations are able to induce other countries to do their bidding on the world stage, not through coercion or threat, but through the attractiveness of their culture. Mexicanness, of course, has been often limited to stereotypes about tequila, tortillas, and mariachi bands, quite apart from all the bad press about narco-violence coming out of the region. And it's also fallen behind, and there was a feeling it was fallen behind emerging powerhouses such as Brazil in the region, and even being challenged by up-and-coming nation brands like Colombia. So the projects involved analysis of the notions of Mexicanness across 10 markets, from the Middle East to Japan to North America, and then a synthesis of the findings, condensing these emergent associations into 8 brand stories, all of which could form of fuel for forging a new and more engaging narrative about this new Mexico. And finally, a slightly more self-contained project. I conducted a smaller project for a design agency last year who'd been engaged by an international food company to look at some of the connotations around a logo, essentially. And the logo involved a kind of cockerel shape, albeit very abstracted. And they wanted to know what the connotations of the cockerel were in Russia, India, and China. So it's a fascinating project. And I got some interesting reports back, which talked not only about the folkloric and historical resonances of these figures, but also popular contemporary visual cultural representations of the cockerel in, for example, the restaurant trade and online. And essentially, as a result of this, we were able to identify the dominant and emergent associations and essentially conclude that in China and Russia, the cockerel is far better seen than in India, but there are ways of recommending a rendering of the logo that would help circumvent and overcome some of the obstacles in that market too. So those are my examples of the different service offerings of brand understanding, brand inspiration, brand evaluation, and global intelligence, and how they work. So I think hopefully that gives you a flavor of how semiotics can be applied. By way of conclusion, I'm not going to belabor the point on the conclusions, because I'm hoping that I've given you an insight to what semiotics is and how it works. I'm going to be wrapping up in a couple of minutes and handing over to Asif, but I just thought I'd leave you with sort of 4 thoughts, and hopefully there'll be more thoughts and more questions as a result of what I presented to you over the last half an hour. But you know, semiotics is a critical perspective and one of the best ways we have for looking at brand meaning. It helps brand owners better understand the meaning in their own brands, and also helps them better understand their competitors in order to sort of forge appropriate strategies. It's very versatile and can be applied to help in brand understanding, inspiration, and evaluation. And I would argue also that it represents a strong competitive advantage, particularly in a world full of cluttered with brands and new entrants. So just before I finish, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things I'm involved with in the world of semiotics outside my revenue generating activity that I think is worth flagging up. So one is there is a semiotic thinking group on LinkedIn, which is a professional group which was founded in March 2010. I founded it, but now I'm just a spectator, and I marvel at how these things take on their own momentum. It's now almost 2,000 members strong, and there's some amazing debates on there happening all the time, people asking questions and sharing their experience. So I'm really proud to have been some part in that. Secondly, there's the SemioFest event, which is essentially it's a celebration of semiotic thinking. It's not a formal conference, it's actually more of an unconference. So we have urban games, we experiment with decoding text together, we have presentations, we watch films, and we exchange ideas on semiotics. And the next event's happening actually in June, end of May, beginning of June in Barcelona this year. So if anyone's interested in going to that, just go to www.semiofest.com or drop me a mail afterwards. I'll be happy to pass you on to Gabriella, who's organising it in Barcelona this year. Finally, Semionauts, run by Malcolm Evans, Space Doctors. It's a webzine online. I think it's www.semionaut.net. And it's dedicated to, as it says, signifying everything. So it's essentially very short semiotic snacks, if you like. So people analysing ads, you know, things like 50 Shades of Grey, new films, all sorts of cultural texts from the semiotic perspective. It's a good read, so I recommend that. So anyway, that's all from me. Sorry I've run on slightly. This is just to thank you very much for listening, and to pass on to Asif, who will be taking you through his perspective on semiotics. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.